Questions surrounding the decline of Lake Mead have circulated for years, but one detail continues to surprise even longtime observers of the Colorado River system. Everyone notices the shrinking shoreline. Everyone sees the pale mineral bathtub ring etched across canyon walls. Headlines often focus on drought, rising temperatures, and water shortages across the American Southwest. Yet beneath the surface lies another problem that receives far less attention. The reservoir itself has been slowly losing part of its storage capacity for decades, even when water remains available upstream. Lake Mead has not merely dropped because less water entered the reservoir. Part of the lake has effectively been disappearing from the bottom upward. Sediment carried by the Colorado River and its tributaries has been accumulating behind Hoover Dam ever since the structure was completed during the 1930s. The process is gradual enough to escape public attention year by year, but over the course of nearly a century, the scale becomes impossible to ignore. The numbers tell the story with startling clarity. Hoover Dam's approximate bedrock foundation sits near 640 feet, or about 195 meters, above sea level at its deepest structural base. Yet the sediment level behind the dam has already risen to approximately 750 feet, or around 229 meters. That means roughly 110 feet, equivalent to about 33 meters, of potential storage depth has effectively been lost beneath accumulated mud, sand, silt, gravel, and mineral deposits since the reservoir first began filling in the 1930s. For many people, the revelation sounds counterintuitive. Reservoirs are usually discussed in terms of water elevation, not in terms of disappearing depth. Public conversation often centers on whether Lake Mead sits at 1,070 feet, 1,050 feet, or below 1,000 feet above sea level. Yet those numbers describe the water surface, not the true remaining storage geometry of the lake itself. The deeper reality is that the floor of the reservoir has been slowly rising for generations. Lake Mead, located along the border of Nevada and Arizona, was created by the construction of Hoover Dam across the Colorado River. Completed during the Great Depression and officially dedicated in the mid-1930s, Hoover Dam transformed the river into one of the most important water storage and hydroelectric systems in North America. The reservoir became a critical lifeline for cities, farms, industries, and energy networks across the Southwest, eventually serving tens of millions of people in states including California, Arizona, and Nevada. From the beginning, engineers understood that all reservoirs face sedimentation. Rivers naturally transport enormous quantities of eroded material downstream. When a river flows freely, much of that material continues onward toward deltas, floodplains, or the ocean. Once a major dam interrupts the current, however, the flow slows dramatically. Slower water loses its ability to carry heavier particles, causing sediment to settle out onto the reservoir floor. Over time, those deposits accumulate layer upon layer. The process is not unique to Lake Mead. Nearly every large dam on Earth experiences some degree of sediment buildup. Yet Lake Mead presents a particularly important example because of its scale, age, and strategic significance. The Colorado River drains a vast watershed stretching across mountainous terrain, desert plateaus, and erosion-prone landscapes throughout the western United States. Every flood season, every thunderstorm, every landslide, and every runoff event carries additional material downstream into the reservoir. At first, the buildup was barely noticeable. During the early decades after Hoover Dam's completion, Lake Mead still possessed immense unused capacity. Water levels fluctuated seasonally, but the sheer size of the reservoir masked the slow accumulation occurring at the bottom. Sediment deposits spread unevenly across submerged canyons and river channels, gradually raising sections of the lake bed while remaining invisible from the surface. As decades passed, however, the accumulated material became increasingly significant. The reservoir's original depth profile changed. Areas once capable of holding deep water transformed into sediment plains, buried beneath murky deposits. Although the lake could still appear vast from above, part of its designed storage space no longer existed in practical terms. The implications extend beyond simple measurements. Reservoir capacity determines how effectively a water system can manage droughts, floods, and seasonal fluctuations. A deeper reservoir can store more runoff during wet years, providing greater resilience during dry periods. As sediment occupies more space, the system gradually loses flexibility. Public concern intensified during the early 21st century as prolonged drought conditions gripped the Colorado River basin. Water levels at Lake Mead declined dramatically after years of reduced snowpack and persistent overuse across the watershed. Satellite images showing exposed shorelines circulated widely online. Boat ramps became unusable. Formerly submerged structures emerged from receding waters. The reservoir that once approached full capacity began reaching historically low elevations. One critical threshold repeatedly discussed by federal water managers is 1,070 feet, or about 326 meters, above sea level. At that level, shortage declarations and water delivery reductions begin affecting downstream users under existing agreements. As lake levels dropped toward that threshold, emergency planning intensified across the Southwest. Another major benchmark sits near 950 feet, approximately 289 meters above sea level. This is commonly referred to as the minimum power pool elevation. Below that point, Hoover Dam's hydroelectric turbines can no longer efficiently generate electricity. Hydropower production declines sharply as water pressure decreases, threatening a major source of renewable energy for the region. Even more alarming is the so-called dead pool level near 895 feet, or roughly 273 meters above sea level. At that elevation, water would no longer flow downstream through the dam under normal operating conditions. Deliveries to major downstream regions could effectively stop without extraordinary emergency measures. These thresholds dominate media coverage because they directly affect electricity generation and water distribution. Yet sediment introduces another dimension to the crisis. Even if future wet years temporarily restore higher water levels, the reservoir itself no longer possesses the same original storage potential that existed during the 1930s and 1940s. Part of the lake is permanently occupied by accumulated material unless massive dredging or sediment removal operations occur, something considered economically and logistically daunting on such a scale. One particularly revealing detail involves the so-called third intake system near Las Vegas. Concerns about dropping water levels prompted the construction of a deeper intake tunnel capable of drawing water from lower elevations than older intake structures. The intake sits near 850 feet, approximately 259 meters, above sea level. That elevation matters because it lies below the official dead pool threshold. In practical terms, the intake was designed to ensure that the Las Vegas region could continue accessing water even if Lake Mead fell to critically low levels. Yet sediment complicates the picture. Since the sediment level behind the dam already sits near 750 feet, the intake effectively extends upward from a zone only about 100 feet, or around 30 meters, above accumulated deposits. The realization changes public perception of the reservoir's remaining depth. Many imagine a vast, open underwater canyon beneath the intake structures, but significant portions of that depth are already filled with decades of sediment accumulation. The issue also illustrates a larger truth about dam infrastructure worldwide. Large dams are often described as monumental engineering achievements built to last indefinitely, but many were never intended to function forever without maintenance challenges. Sedimentation represents one of the most predictable long-term limitations. Engineers have long understood that reservoirs gradually lose capacity over time, though the timeline varies dramatically depending on river conditions and sediment loads. In Lake Mead's case, nearly a century of accumulation has already erased a meaningful portion of the original depth profile. While 100 feet may sound modest compared with the reservoir's overall dimensions, the loss becomes significant when measured across an enormous submerged area extending more than 110 miles, or approximately 177 kilometers, at maximum length. The sediment itself tells a geological history of the American West. Fine silts from desert erosion, mineral-rich particles from canyon walls, organic material, flood debris, and runoff from tributaries have all settled into the reservoir. Each layer represents years of hydrological activity across the Colorado River basin. Climate variability intensifies the problem. Periods of heavy flooding can transport large pulses of sediment into reservoirs. Wildfires, which have become increasingly severe across western North America, may further accelerate erosion by stripping vegetation from hillsides. Burned terrain often produces higher sediment runoff during subsequent storms, adding even more material to downstream waterways. Agricultural development throughout the watershed also influences sediment transport. Irrigation canals, land disturbance, grazing practices, and urban expansion can alter natural erosion patterns, sometimes increasing the amount of loose material entering river systems. Over many decades, these contributions accumulate within reservoirs like Lake Mead. At the same time, declining water levels expose another paradox. Lower reservoirs sometimes allow rivers to cut channels deeper into accumulated sediments, redistributing deposits internally. Yet such processes rarely restore meaningful original capacity without large-scale intervention. Most sediment remains trapped behind the dam because the river lacks the energy needed to carry it downstream, once flow velocities diminish within the reservoir basin. Removing sediment from a reservoir as massive as Lake Mead presents staggering logistical challenges. Dredging operations on such a scale would require enormous financial investment, extensive environmental review, and long-term disposal strategies for extracted material. Some experts have proposed sediment bypass systems or controlled flushing operations for reservoirs worldwide, but Hoover Dam's design and operational constraints complicate such approaches. Meanwhile, public attention continues focusing primarily on drought alone. Drought undeniably remains central to the reservoir's decline. Reduced snowpack in the Rocky Mountains has diminished river flows feeding the Colorado River system. Rising temperatures increase evaporation rates from reservoirs and soil surfaces. Water demand across rapidly growing cities has remained intense for decades. Agriculture throughout the basin consumes enormous quantities of river water each year. Yet sediment demonstrates that the reservoir's challenges cannot be understood solely through rainfall statistics or annual runoff measurements. The system is simultaneously losing water and losing part of its storage structure. One problem affects the amount of water entering the lake. The other affects how much water the lake can physically hold over the long term. The distinction matters because future wet periods may not restore conditions as fully as many assume. Even exceptionally snowy winters cannot reverse decades of accumulated sediment. The reservoir may refill visually, but part of its original design capacity has already vanished beneath deposited material. Lake Mead's famous bathtub ring offers another reminder of long-term change. The white mineral stains visible along canyon walls mark previous high water elevations, in some places standing more than 100 feet above current levels. Those exposed walls reveal how dramatically the lake has receded during prolonged drought years. Yet beneath the waterline, another transformation has been occurring simultaneously as sediments slowly thicken across the reservoir floor. The combined effect reshapes the operational future of Hoover Dam. Water managers must navigate increasingly narrow margins between shortage thresholds, power generation limits, intake accessibility, and downstream delivery obligations. Every foot of elevation matters. The numbers frequently cited in public discussions underscore the reservoir's precarious balancing act. Full pool elevation stands near 1,229 feet, or about 375 meters above sea level. Shortage reductions begin near 1,070 feet, roughly 326 meters. Minimum power pool occurs near 950 feet, around 289 meters. Dead pool arrives near 895 feet, approximately 273 meters. The sediment level sits near 750 feet, close to 229 meters. Hoover Dam's approximate bedrock base rests near 640 feet, or around 195 meters. Viewed together, the measurements reveal how much vertical space has already been consumed over the reservoir's lifespan. The broader Colorado River system faces mounting pressure as population growth continues across the Southwest. Metropolitan regions including Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and San Diego depend directly or indirectly on river allocations linked to Lake Mead and related infrastructure. Agricultural regions producing vegetables, fruits, forage crops, and livestock feed likewise rely heavily on Colorado River water deliveries. As demand rises and hydrological uncertainty increases, the hidden loss of reservoir capacity becomes more consequential. sediment accumulation effectively reduces the system's buffer against future shortages. The phenomenon also exposes the long timescales involved in water infrastructure planning. Hoover Dam was conceived during an era when engineering ambition often emphasized permanence and mastery over nature. The structure remains one of the most iconic civil engineering achievements in American history. Yet nearly a century later, natural geological processes continue reshaping the reservoir despite the dam's immense scale. Rivers do not stop carrying sediment simply because concrete barriers interrupt their flow. Gravity, erosion, runoff, and mineral transport continue operating year after year, generation after generation. The reservoir slowly adapts to those forces whether policymakers notice or not. The changing depth profile of Lake Mead also affects ecological conditions within the reservoir. Sediment layers can alter water circulation patterns, influence oxygen distribution, and affect habitats for fish and aquatic organisms. Shallow sediment-rich zones may behave differently thermally and chemically compared with deeper open water areas. As the reservoir evolves, ecological dynamics evolve with it. Navigation infrastructure faces additional complications. Marinas, docks, and boat ramps originally designed for different water elevations require constant adaptation as shorelines retreat. Sediment accumulation near river inlets can create shifting underwater terrain that complicates navigation channels and recreational access. Even archaeology has entered the conversation surrounding Lake Mead's decline. Falling water levels have exposed long submerged objects, structures, and remains previously hidden beneath the reservoir. Yet beneath exposed shorelines, the sediment layers themselves preserve decades of environmental history trapped within the lakebed. The reservoir's future will depend on a combination of hydrology, policy decisions, infrastructure adaptation, conservation efforts, and climate conditions. Short-term improvements in snowpack may temporarily raise lake levels, but long-term sustainability remains uncertain. One especially important reality often overlooked in public debate is that Lake Mead was designed during an unusually wet climatic period. Early 20th century river flow estimates used to allocate Colorado River water rights may have overstated the river's long-term average capacity. As modern measurements reveal lower average flows, the imbalance between water demand and natural supply becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Against that backdrop, sedimentation becomes even more significant. If the reservoir cannot physically store as much water as originally intended, the system's margin for error narrows further. Public fascination with the 100 feet lost figure reflects more than simple curiosity. The number transforms an abstract environmental issue into something tangible. People can visualize a building losing 100 feet of height or a canyon filling upward by 30 meters. The statistic reframes Lake Mead's decline not merely as disappearing water, but as a slow transformation of the reservoir itself. The surprise lies in the fact that this process has been unfolding continuously since Hoover Dam first impounded the Colorado River. Long before viral videos and drought headlines captured public attention, sediment had already begun settling behind the dam. Every passing year added another thin layer, individually insignificant, collectively transformative.